we are looking at the possibility of a limited, narrow act that would help make sure that not only Syria but others around the world understand that the international community cares about maintaining this chemical weapons ban.
President Obama today warning that a military strike on Syria is warranted in retaliation for what the U.S. says it has confirmed as chemical weapons attacks on civilians. Now, there's no final decision yet on when an attack could be launched or what kind of attack, but Obama said it would not be open-ended, it would not involve boots on the ground, it would not involve getting involved in a civil war, it would be a limited and narrow strike. No one knows what that actually means. Meantime, allies like the UK and Canada have opted out of military intervention. By the way, we hear there's lots of very robust words of exchange between David Cameron and the Labour Party leader Miliband after Cameron lost that vote that we had here live on the program last night. But lots of questions about the risks for the U.S. to go it alone or alongside France. Is military action the right response? Could it ignite a broader conflict? And what about Obama's strategy? Fen Hampson is the director of the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. And in Washington, Emanuele Ottolenghi is the senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. They will debate this today. Good to see both of you. Fen Hampson, your take on Obama's red line and today's announcement.
This is a total disaster in diplomatic terms. Obama can't even round up the usual suspects for this operation. In the Libyan conflict, the United States was prepared to lead from behind, Evan. In this case, there's nobody out in front and there's nobody behind. And for the United States even to be contemplating limited military strikes with very tepid political support from the allies, I think speaks volumes to a foreign policy that is in big trouble.
All right. Mr. Ottolenghi, what's your take?
I couldn't agree more. We can debate about the desirability of punishment on Bashar al-Assad. I actually am very much in favor of that. But the current situation points out to the total unraveling of the Obama administration's foreign policy for the region. And this is largely because of the president's own choices or decisions to procrastinate decisions or decisions to stay out of trouble at all costs. I think that had this administration recalibrated its choices earlier on in the crisis, we would not have to confront the situation now.
But in what way could they recalibrate? Remember, leading up to this so-called red line moment, there was concerns about who the rebels were, whether there were Islamist forces involved there. They didn't want to enter into a civil sectarian violence or a civil war. There was obviously a lot of war exhaustion and fatigue post-Iraq and Afghanistan. What else could they do?
They could have done...
Go on, Mr. Ottolenghi, and then Fen Hampson.
Sorry, yeah, no, I thought it was a follow-up question for me. These concerns were expressed very early on in the Syrian crisis. Inaction has actually made these concerns part of the reality we confront today. The demonstrations against the regime began peacefully, largely peacefully, without weapons, and the presence of radical jihadis on the ground is a development that followed our decision not to intervene. We have contracted the role of confronting and containing Syria's murderous instincts with the support of their associate countries, Russia and Iran, to Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are not going to choose and prefer as rebels forces that embrace liberal democratic values. So that all of the things that we worried about and used as a reason or a pretext for inaction have actually happened anyway as a consequence of the West staying out of this disaster.
This has really been a situation that is the result of successive failures of diplomacy. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there's one country that does have real leverage over Assad, and that's Russia. And if you look at the relationship between the United States and Russia, despite a number of attempts to hit the reset button, Evan, it just goes from bad to worse. And what's going to happen now with these strikes is that the so-called Geneva talks that are supposedly to bring these parties together aren't going to go anywhere because the Russians aren't going to be on side.
All right, so you guys are talking about a diplomatic what should have happened before the diplomatic strategy. People out there say, all right, what about the conventions against the use of chemical weapons? If there was a civil war, and you can't intervene in every civil war, and there's lots of understanding despite the responsibility to protect. When someone uses chemical weapons, if that is indeed some kind of red line, how should and could the world respond? Kerry's response is, if we don't respond now, not only is the credibility of the U.S. questioned, but dictators might use chemical weapons with impunity. What do you say to that?
Well, there should have been, first of all, collective red lines drawn as opposed to individual red lines drawn by the President of the United States. And secondly, there should have been a much more coherent, sustained diplomatic effort earlier on. Even if we're looking at military action, to have a NATO resolution. We don't even have a NATO resolution. One of your guests earlier was talking about Kosovo. Well, the reason Kosovo happened was because NATO, as a collective alliance, decided to act together.
So what should the response be? I mean, if Assad has used chemical weapons, the U.S. now say they have evidence that the UN will not change, Mr. Ottolenghi. What should the U.S. response be now?
Look, the fact that the U.S. is standing alone in making the use of chemical weapons a red line is not a sign of diplomatic failure on the part of the U.S. or anyone else. It's a sign of how sadly paralyzed and indifferent is the international community to the commitments that it has taken upon itself to rid this world of chemical weapons. There is a ban on the use of chemical weapons through a convention that has been signed by almost every country in the world.
Not Syria,
and yet nobody wants to actually take any action when these things happen. Now, you mentioned Kosovo. Let's actually rewind a bit to Bosnia and relate that crisis to diplomatic talks. It's as if we wanted to go back to 1994 when 8,000 Muslims were massacred in Srebrenica, and then go to the Bosnian government and to the Slovenians who had already left the federation and say to them, why don't you get back together in a multi-party system with the Serbs? This is just not going to happen after 100,000 people and counting are confirmed dead. You have millions of displaced people, and now you have the extensive, repeated, unpunished use of chemical weapons.
Right,
that is why diplomacy is not going to work right now.
Okay, so I got a minute left here. The U.S. says they're going to strike some limited way. Is that the only response left for the U.S. now that they say that the Assad regime has confirmed to have used chemical weapons?
Well, what we're going to see sometime over the next couple of days, Evans, is the U.S. is going to fire a couple of cruise missiles and hit some military sites in Syria. Is that going to stop Assad? I don't think so. He is emboldened right now. He sees an international community that is not being led, and I disagree with your previous with the guest who just said that there isn't collective will in the international community. Well, that comes through leadership, Evan. It comes from the United States getting the allies behind them, and this clearly hasn't happened. And so, what is Assad going to do? He may continue to use chemical weapons, and then what?
All right, I got 30 seconds. Any response, Mr. Ottolenghi? What is the U.S.'s? What are their options right now?
A military attack will work if it is designed and it is sustained to achieve a significant tilt of balance on the ground. If the regime is deprived in a very damaging and devastating way with the means that are currently giving the regime the edge in the civil war, that will be a significant development. And that actually, just like it did in Bosnia in 94-95 with NATO intervention, create the conditions for diplomatic talks.
All right, we still await what the U.S. will actually do. Van Hamsen, Emanuele Ottolenghi, we are watching this situation unfold very closely. I appreciate your time.